With Saw X being released, it got me thinking about some of the other traps that have been around in the other Saw movies. The traps are what essentially makes these movies stand out and gives them the memorability factor, and there are some which have been far more gruesome, complicated, and well thought out when compared to the others. So I thought I'd explain the most brutal ones along with ranking them, so let's get into it. Here is the most brutal Saw traps explained and ranked. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The Lover's Triangle. Now this trap was not only creative, but it looked so painful, and it actually had a bit of mystery around it. From Saw VII, with it being named after what it was quite literally about, a love triangle. We saw a woman and two guys waking up in a display window in the middle of a town positioned in the shape of a triangle. The girl on the top and the two guys to the left and right of her on the ground. With three electric saws that were present in the box which Brad and Ryan were chained to, they could be moved by forcing them in a certain direction, or if left, it would mean that Dina would fall onto the one in the middle. Both of the guys had to decide who it was that would be removed from the love triangle, and ultimately face the blades of the saw as it was pushed towards them. The winner would be deemed the alpha male and be the person that got to live out the rest of their days with Dina. Something I'd be surprised if any of them would want to do, considering that she played the both of them. With both of the guys pushing towards each other and Dina rooting for Brad, we saw Brad end up on the back foot, and in the end, her actions ended up costing her her life. As Ryan took charge and got Brad on his side, and they ended up waiting for her to drop into the saw in the middle, resulting in her ending up in half. There was only 1 minute to do this trap, and it felt like no time at all. With Dina resulting in being the victim, it was a slow death that looked so painful, and it looked horrific to be on the receiving end of it. It's definitely one of the most gruesome ones that the show has produced. The fact that this was all in the center of the public eye too is something that adds to the reason as to why it was on this list, as it showed that there was no hiding from the shame. The Knife Chair. One trap that has long lived in my memory of being one of the most brutal is the knife chair. From Saw IV, it's quite self-explanatory. The subject, Cecil, was placed in a chair that had knives and blades that were all around it, on the arms and in front of the subject's face. This was a trap that was focused on making the subject as ugly on the outside as their soul was on the inside. In order for the subject to get out of the trap, they had to push themselves forwards, which in turn would rub the blades across their face, and it would then in turn release the restraints that were across their arms, and they'd become free. If they didn't, then they'd essentially lose blood and not be able to make it out alive. One thing that made this trap horrific was the obvious stinging that it felt like the subject would endure when moving forward into the blades. But the sound effects that were present when this was playing out was absolutely spine-chilling. Sharp knives swishing across ran through my ears, and it definitely added to it. Even once the subject was free, after having supposed to have learned their lesson, we saw them run towards Kramer, and ultimately fall into a cage of barbed wire, which looked impossible to get out of. Even though technically it wasn't part of the original trap, that adds to the brutality of it, and gives it even more of a reason to be on this list. The Fishhook Trap. This is another trap from Saw VII. This was one that looked awful to be a part of. We saw the subject Nina being locked in a chair, and there was a fishhook that was inside of her that had a key on the end of it. The key that would stop the trap from playing out as intended. Bobby was also inside of the room with her, and he had to pull the key out from inside of her within the space of a minute. If he didn't, then the 4 spikes that were around her would slowly move towards her and kill her. As well as that, if the decibel level increased within the room, then the spikes would automatically move. So it was one that was against the clock, only 1 minute, so not long at all. And the other threat was the noise level, so Nina couldn't scream in the slightest, no matter how much pain she was in. This was one where I felt physically sick watching it, and I felt like I was on the cusp of gagging or retching. Watching Bobby slowly pull the hook out and hearing Nina's suffering was hard to not only watch, but also hard to listen to. Seeing how slow the spikes were moving also meant that it would be such a slow way to go. They were extremely thick spikes too, so it would be something which would be extremely painful, and you'd be aware of it the whole time. So with your innards becoming your outards after being hooked up, and the thick spikes piercing, this is definitely a brutal one. The Coffin. This is actually one of my favourite traps in the entirety of the movie franchise, because I never really expected a trap to have a twist within it. With Agent Peter Strom finding Detective Hoffman inside of the room in front of a glass coffin, he thought that the coffin filled with glass was going to end up as part of a trap. However, the opposite happened. With Strom fighting Hoffman one-on-one and locking him in the coffin filled with glass, we believed that he'd won. However, on the contrary, the game had only just begun. The coffin was there so that it could be lowered into the ground and lie level with the rest of the surface so it wouldn't get impacted by the actual trap that was going to be taking place. Hoffman was safe inside the coffin, and the real danger was outside, where Agent Strom was now stuck inside of a room with no way out, where the walls were closing in at speed and he'd eventually be flattened. With Hoffman looking on and the coffin getting covered in blood as the room slowly got smaller, you could only imagine the fear that was within Strom as the walls were closing in. We saw the bones were breaking, and even though he was fighting, there was nothing that he could do. I think I'd be fearful if I was Hoffman that the walls wouldn't open up and I'd be stuck down there for good. But no, this was a brutal and an extremely intelligent trap because of the twist. The Bone Marrow Trap. Now I know this one could seem like a bit of recency bias for it being included in the list, but I really do feel as though this trap was one of the harshest, most brutal, and most difficult to complete. With Valentina facing this in Saw X, it definitely felt like one which was never going to be completed, so I commend the character for getting so close. Whilst being chained up and unable to move from the spot, with a mechanical gigli saw facing the subject's neck, they would have 3 minutes to use the other saw that was by the side of them to chop off their leg, something which was horrific to watch. Going from underneath with a saw that you had to go back and forth with seemed like one of the worst pains imaginable, and it would most definitely take up a lot of that allocated 3 minutes. Once the leg was cut off cleanly, the subject then had to stick a suction device into their leg and retrieve 3 ounces of bone marrow. It was once that was then complete, then the key would be released, which would have freed the individual from the trap. However, obviously, they would have lost their leg in the process, but they would have their life saved. If this wasn't done in time and the weight of the bone marrow was the tiniest amount under, then the mechanical device would activate after the 3-minute countdown, and activated the gigli saw that was in front of the subject's neck, and it would move towards them. And by not being able to evade the moving saw due to being chained up, it would provide a clean cut, rendering the subject headless and legless. Well, one legless. It's a pretty brutal way to go. 3 minutes of pure suffering due to needing to amputate your leg with an 18th century saw, all for it to not be completed and then being met with another brief encounter with the saw. This is definitely one of the movie franchise's most creative, brutal, and harshest traps, and I had to look away at points when watching it. There are many other traps that are extremely brutal, but these were a few selected favourites of mine, and the ones that have lived long in my memory and kind of combine fear, blood, gore, creativity, and just pure horror. I guarantee I'll get a comment on the reverse bear trap not being included. So, there you have it, the most brutal saw traps explained and ranked. I also explained and ranked all of the traps from Saw X, so if you want to give that a watch then feel free to. It's over on the channel. Which traps do you think are the most brutal? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.